with a word of thanks to the St John Fiona Centre for a wonderful lunch. Dr. Robyn from Australia, sitting here on my right, has drawn the post-siesta session. Robyn is from Australia. She's been a family therapist for 30 years. She's worked for many years on the staff of La Trobe University in Melbourne. She's been part of an innovative team working with families who have experienced trauma and sexual abuse. For a number of years, she provided professional leadership as the Chief Practitioner with the Victorian Department of Human Services, Victoria and one of our states, and the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse that finished last December and ran in Australia for 5 years. Robyn was a consultant to that Royal Commission. She's currently the CEO of the Keynote Family Services in Australia. And the Keynote Family Services is an amalgam of a range of social service initiatives begun by different religious orders, brought together under the name of McKillop, our first saint, St Mary McKillop. Currently, Robyn is part of the board of the recently established Catholic Professional Standards Limited in Australia, and there'll be more said about that in a later session. So, with that broad experience, I'd like you to welcome Robyn.
Thank you very much, Tim. And it's a great honour to address you this afternoon, and I thank you very much for this opportunity. You have enormous wisdom, and you bring with you the cultures and the experience far and wide from across the world. And I don't think I've ever been at a lunch with people from around the world like I've just experienced, and what a fantastic conversation we've just had. I have to say I did come back and delete a few slides, because I had an expert on pedagogy on my left and somebody, different people on my right. So I might get you to stand up and wish each other the sign of peace halfway through, because that was the advice I had during lunch. Or I might tap dance to keep you awake. A famous professor I had who I loved, he said, Robyn, all you've got to do is entertain them. Entertain them. So we've got a very serious subject though, haven't we? And I just want to say up front, how hopeful this whole gathering has made me feel, because when we think of the church in troubled times and all of these issues that have come to light that have created such pain and such angst, but have been such an important process to bring to light the pain and suffering of our most vulnerable children and the legacy in their adult lives that has created such turmoil, when I hear and see the passion and the commitment in the room and your commitment to safeguarding around the world, I'll be going away with a renewed vigour and a greater sense of hope for the church and for what we all bring. So for that, I just want to say thank you, because this is my first time at one of these conferences, and it's been a fantastic opportunity. So Archbishop Mark Coleridge and Cherie Limbrick are going to be speaking much more about the Royal Commission in Australia, and I'll refer to it slightly, but my task today is to really engage you around what we think about around a trauma-informed culture and how we understand the impact of harm and abuse on children, and what are some of the newer, what's some of the newer evidence from research that we do need to understand in order to be at the forefront. And that's where we need to be, I believe. We're called to that through the gospel. We're called to love children. We're called to protect. And those core values have always guided me. And regardless, most of my life I've spent in government work or in academic institutions, and it's only the past 2 years I've come back to a Catholic-based, a faith-based institution like MacKillop. And we are 1,300 staff. We work all over Australia, mostly though in Victoria, where it founded, in New South Wales and in Western Australia. But we teach and provide services and consultation across all of the states. In Australia, we have a big problem in terms of our child protection systems. They are overwhelmed, and I speak with insider knowledge because I was working for the Victorian department. My colleagues, I left a nice family therapy centre called the Bouverie Centre, where I was teaching, and I was also working privately, and you know, I was a happy little family therapist. And then when my friend said, "Why are you going to the dark side?" And it was because there was huge reform and there was great energy to improve the way that child protection systems worked. So I started there in 2006. In that decade, the growth in children since 2006, or 2008 actually, in the last decade through to 2018, there has been an 82% growth in the number of children in out-of-home care. That is a shocking statistic, and that's on my watch, on our watch in Australia. The most shocking statistic is that 36% of children today in out-of-home care, and there are about 46,000 of them, and by out-of-home care, does everyone know what I mean? And that's a reference to, in England, they'd be called looked after children. They're children who can't be at home because of abuse or neglect, and they're taken into some form of care. In Australia, 60% roughly are in what we call kinship care with extended family, or kith or kin. Around 40% in foster care, which is with a family that's been assessed as suitable. And then there's about 5% who are in what we call residential care. And residential care I'm going to come back to because that's one of the most challenging areas. And in fact, the reason I went to the Royal Commission was, in fact, we had been doing a lot of work in Victoria in child protection around the most insidious problem, and that is the problem of child sexual exploitation. So gone are the days that the Royal Commission looked back historically. My passion when I went to the Royal Commission was around what's happening here and now and going forward, given we know the biggest problem we have in child protection and in out-of-home care is the focus that wasn't there on current sex offending. So the cutting-edge problem we have is that predators will contact children using social media, and they are like bees to honey with vulnerable children who've been traumatised already. And they will find ways, they will give them phones, we call them the nasty lover boy. There's different models of exploitation. But basically children are seduced into these relationships where they are then pimped out, basically. And this is happening in every part of Australia. And we were doing a lot about this in Victoria, not as much as what is happening in the US and in the UK. There is more focus. In England, they have a minister, a child sexual exploitation minister, and each local authority has to have a plan. So what we know, these predators are external to the organisation looking after children, and they will access using Facebook or Instagram. They will often pose as an 18-year-old boyfriend who says, come and have fun. They'll be then linking them into often semi-organised, sometimes very organised networks of pedophiles. And when I went into the department in 2006, it was known, but it was seen as, well, that's adolescent experimentation, or that's what kids in residential care do. And I was saying, actually, this is child abuse. They're being sexually abused and it's on our watch. What are we doing about it? And the police were actually loath to intervene. The police would say things like, is she going to make a statement? And it's not just girls, you see. Boys were also. In the parks at Footscray, in the public toilets, there were men hovering there. Kids would get new runners. They would get sometimes a driving lessons. We had kids who were an e-ticket who would then be taken from Melbourne to Sydney. We had video cameras that looked at a 12-year-old coming hand in hand with a pedophile either side of him that had come from Tasmania to Melbourne. So this is a big problem and it wasn't being talked about. And initially it wasn't within the terms of reference to the Royal Commission, but it became so. And so I was willing to then go and work there for that 18 months, because it was more about where do we use all the resources and the research within the Royal Commission about what's important going forward. So the research-based knowledge on the impact of child sexual abuse is well in. We know that the evidence is clear that it not only impacts on their social relationships, it actually impacts on the brain architecture. So the DSM-4, and I know we've got a 5R at the moment, but it defines traumatic events as those which involve actual death or physical injury or threat to bodily integrity. And throughout my career working with many, many, many children and adolescents and their families who've been sexually abused, kids know where the boundary is. They know the lines crossed. And some of the earlier research used to distinguish the impact, whether or not the abuse was penetrative. What we know now is it's less about that, it's more about the meaning the child makes. And the most pernicious abuse is that which is perpetrated by a carer, a known and trusted parent, extended family member, or a carer. So I'm sure you know this, but most sexual abuse is actually intrafamilial. We think about 93%, best evidence. About 6 to 7% is what we call institutional child sexual abuse. But how dreadful for the poor child who's taken away from family because the family can't look after them for various reasons. And most children who've come into out-of-home care have had some form of sexual abuse. And then to be taken into care and then to be abused again by people who are meant to love and care for them. So when we work with children and young people who've been abused in care, there's another whole layer of betrayal. And their experience of adults and anyone who can trust them, who they are trying to trust, is so perverse. It's a wonder they trust any of us, actually. And so we spend a lot of time training our carers and our caseworkers to understand that kids aren't going to welcome you generally. They're going to push you away, they're going to test you out, and they're going to try and work out whether you're just going to be like the next person or the carer before who abused them. The estimation of the risk, and we have child commissioners in Australia, and Bernie Geary was the one in Victoria, and we did some research together with it in the department, and the figure was frightening, and the minister was horrified. As you can imagine, this is a very inconvenient truth. 1 in 3 young people in residential care were being sexually exploited or highly at risk of. So it's a shocking statistic. And that's today. That's today. So the train wreck that happens when a child is sexually abused, and it's often accompanied by family violence, it's often accompanied by neglect, but not always. And we know different children will demonstrate different sequelae. The impact will be variable according to other conditions in the child's life, the quality of their attachment relationship. But if it's your dad and he says, I'm only doing this because I don't want to go outside the family, and your mum would, if you tell him, it'll kill your mother, kids keep the secret because they want to protect, and they're ashamed and they're frightened. And the Royal Commission research was profound. It actually documented, for the first time we had numbers, and this large sample of nearly 8,000 people, the time between the event happening and the disclosure was 22 years on average. 22 years. And certainly that's my experience as a clinician, that if a child, there's nothing normative about disclosure in childhood. There's been exhaustive literature reviews. What's normative is this delayed, protracted, and partial disclosure. Roland Summit talked about child abuse dynamics in 82, and the dynamics I find still, and I teach this today because it makes sense for people. If you think about abuse, it happens in secret. The child is entrapped because the adult's older, wiser, has language, is physically, the child is pinned down usually, or entrapped between legs or with strong arms. The child's entrapped. They're helpless, so helplessness. And then the child has only a choice but to accommodate, so accommodation. And some have called this a child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. It's been critiqued. We know it's not a syndrome, but the dynamics are still very useful. And when a child accommodates, because they have to, if it's your brother or your cousin or your grandfather or an aunt or some teacher at school, and we know in Australia, actually, if you look at the statistics around convictions, the greatest group of professionals who are convicted each year are in fact teachers. And that's true in many Western nations. It's unsurprising though if you think about opportunity. What Finkelhor, and somebody from America mentioned, yes, you mentioned Finkelhor. To offend against a child, the offender has to groom, not just the child, but the people around them. And in any of us running social services today and looking after children, this is a huge issue. And we tend to positively connote those who want to work with children. We think, oh, they're a nice guy or a nice person. So we have what we call a confirmation bias. And there are very predictable thinking errors that we all need to be aware of. And this confirmation bias is that, oh, somebody who works in this field is a nice person. Well, we all know that's not true. But it's very difficult for people who are trusting and respectful of colleagues to actually start to see the wood from the trees and to know the indicators of when abuse is happening. Because as I said, if children aren't usually telling, they're more often showing through their behaviour. And their behaviours will have very predictable indicators, but sometimes what we look for is this complex change in behaviour. And at different ages and stages, so some kids when they're little will start wetting the bed. They won't want to go to kinder. You might get the adolescent, and we know trauma can actually lie dormant. It can't show its face sometimes until there's a particular trigger, and then it floods the young person and the behaviours change. So we have a number of different patterns. What Finkelhor talked about, though, was overcoming the internal inhibitors of the offender, has to overcome his own conscience, and also the external inhibitors, the people surrounding the child. And the common denominator is this abuse of power and the over-entitled thinking. So part of my 14 years at Bouverie, I worked with offenders as well as with survivors and children who'd been victimised. And what I learnt was the insidious nature and the planning and the opportunistic sort of work that offenders do to really establish this relationship with the child. One offender said to me, he said, you know, Robyn, he said, I take 6 months before I touch a child. You find out everything about them. Tim mentioned the Collingwood Football Club. He said you find out whether they like Collingwood, whether they barrack for Carlton. You find out whether they're into photography. Then you casually leave around some photographic books. Then you casually open up on some pornography. And then you desensitise them to touch. And then you might throw in some alcohol. So offenders will be very particular in how they abuse children. And that grooming and targeting, as we know. So when we're thinking about that, we know trauma fragments, doesn't it? Judith Herman talked about this. If you haven't read a book on her book on trauma and recovery, you must. Judith Herman, 1992. It's an oldie, but it's a real goodie. And she talks about that trauma fragments the sense of self, families, communities. And we all know about how it fragments church communities. Because it is unbelievable to think that this person could do this. Kathy Humphries coined the phrase, the fluid nature of belief. And when mothers have to deal with their partner who has abused their child, or a trusted cleric or a teacher, it's like, I believe my child, and about 70% of parents do believe their child at the point of disclosure. Higher than most people understand. The 30% that end up in therapist's office and in child protection tend to dominate the literature. But the best research we have says at the time of disclosure, about 70% are believed and supported. And if you think about the prevalence rates, that does make sense. Because we know the one thing that contributes to healing is the belief and support of non-offending family members. And bearing witness to the sorrow and the suffering of the child. It's actually incredibly simple. And that's the great tragedy, where the church hasn't provided that sense of bearing witness and that solidarity with victims, and the difference it makes when the church does that and provides that compassionate bearing witness is enormous. So I use the analogy of a train wreck because many survivors, many victims have used that analogy when describing the impact on their own lives. We know that the institutional culture makes a huge difference, and we know that the sad stories where children were punished, a failure to enforce and educate staff, and not accepting that there were systemic failures through recruitment and staff training, and leaders actively denied responsibility. Matsakis wrote a great book called Why Can't I Get Over It? Aphrodite Matsakis, 1996, a great name, isn't it? And she talked about the secondary wounding. And in working with families over these decades, what creates, and again, if you can apply this to the church context as well, what has been actually more wounding, it's not just the abuse experience, it's that whole notion of being ostracised, being silenced or not believed, and then being marginalised. That's why all of you give me such hope, because you're doing the opposite. You want to know you are educated and you're doing something about it. So we all know the problems that trauma creates throughout the life's course, actually. Many of us in the field would say that the real train wreck happens in the person's 30s and 40s. It impacts on their parenting. For a number of years, I did consultancy with drug and alcohol addiction services. There was never under 80%. It was more like 90 to 100% when I'd say, hands up those of your clients who've been sexually abused. So if you think about addiction, what does it do? It's self-medicating. We know about eating disorders, much higher rates. Mullen's research talked about suicide rates being up to 70 times greater if you've experienced childhood sexual abuse. We need to know that the trauma's over, that there's lasting supports for children, routine and consistency, deep reassurance, and the need to assess and provide that professional support if that is still needed. I'm happy to share these slides, so I'm going to go through these quickly. What's less understood, though, is in fact the impact in these most vulnerable years if the abuse happens when the child's very young. And we know about plasticity in the brain, and there's been a whole explosion of knowledge in the trauma field and in neuroscience that is so important for us to know. Because people think it's a bad experience back there. But in fact, from the child's perspective, it has an impact physiologically.
You think of the brain as a massive collection of billions and billions of cells. It's the connections, the circuits among the cells that are really responsible for all the work that the brain does. Most of those circuits are developed early in life. So literally the experiences that children have, the kind of world they live in, and particularly the relationships they have, literally shape what's called the architecture of their brain. And when the environment is not safe to protect, when it's violent, when it's unpredictable, when it is abusive, when it's very neglecting, it activates physiological systems that make your stress hormones level up, particularly the stress hormone called cortisol. The cortisol level that goes up and stays up for days or months at a time literally poisons the circuits that are developing at that time in the brain. Whether it's the circuits for communication, whether it's the circuits for building trust in a relationship. You live with that disrupted circuit for the rest of your life.
One of the things children learn in the first year of life, particularly the second half of the first year of life, is to form an important relationship with at least one person, maybe more than one person. And for children who've been taken out of their home because they've been abused and neglected, put in one of our placements, they don't learn that. And so what you see is a growing inability to trust people.
So the understanding from attachment theory and research is profound. And what's so interesting is the whole field of epigenetics that's opening up. So when you think about the impact of an adult who's been victimised as a child and then their capacity as a parent, if they have these mental health problems or alcohol and drug addiction, etc. And that's what we see in child protection. We know, as I said, trauma can lie dormant. Something can trigger it, like a smell. It can lie dormant off until your child reaches the age you were when the abuse happened. It can lie dormant until a certain media event happens. And for many people, the media attention has created the memories coming flooding back. It intrudes on your sleep. You have nightmares. You don't want to think about it, but it comes to the front of your head. And so people develop these what we call avoidant behaviours. And that's our job is to get into safety in that therapeutic window where we're accompanying people on this journey towards recovery, or at least being able to manage this dysregulated state where they're pumping adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. You know that feeling almost when you have a car accident? That's how they're living, and it's exhausting. So you can imagine why this gets in the way of kids learning. They're frequently then, as in this position of being a victim. This is a classic sort of Cartman's triangle, it's called, but it's a classic pattern that we see. Empathy shuts down. It's not fair is the position of the victim. Stuff it, I don't care. And so the empathy for others shuts down. And they're constantly then in this state of harming others. And we know with kids in care particularly, one of our biggest problems is child-to-child sexual abuse. And this is something that we're doing a lot of training of staff, and it's our responsibility as adults to help kids to understand and not to do this. But it's often at the red light, the red flag for their own abuse experience. And they're frequently taking crazy risks and rescuing. So the sort of families that we work with that are stuck in this triangle is often this tragic sort of pattern that we as professionals have to interrupt. So the child and caregiver relationship is critical. How do we then as an organisation start to think about being trauma-informed? And what does it really mean when we have responsibility? As I said at MacKillop, on any one night we care for about 800 children who've been through these abuse experiences. In foster care and in residential care, we have about 38 houses where about up to 4 children live. And what we've done is said, look, we cannot sit with this sexual exploitation risk anymore. We have to do something. So we've partnered with Melbourne University and we have a respectful relationships action research program on foot, respecting sexual safety, we call it. We want the kids to come up with a better name. But what we're going to be doing is actually talking to kids about healthy relationships, which you'd think, well, that's normal, you should be doing that anyway. But what we find is particularly sex education is often overlooked when children are in out-of-home care. And we need to train them about what is predatory behaviour. So that we've got a whole program, and that's just beginning. So we're very happy about that, and the government have funded us and some philanthropic funds. But that will have an international applicability because there's no evidence base in terms of prevention of child sexual exploitation. So the key messages through the Royal Commission again and again and again were around governance and leadership. That in order to make organisations safe for children, regardless of whether it's a school, a parish, or a hospital, it is all about the culture and the leadership. And I want to quote Commissioner Robert Fitzgerald, because he was an outstanding commissioner at the Royal Commission. And what he talked about was the importance of having the heart of the house, the heart of the culture, engaged. He said, if in 10 years' time you have every policy and procedure in place and you meet every mandatory standard, but you do not have a genuine culture of safety, then you will fail. What we have seen over the decades is that bad culture breeds bad conduct. And the Royal Commission articulated 10 key elements of forming a child-safe culture. And you'll hear more about that during the conference. But the key one is to have leadership on board. And I did my PhD research actually looking at the reform we did inside child protection in the state of Victoria. And we were able to focus more on family support rather than all the money going into the pointy end, which is out-of-home care and child protection. Because we know if we can get to families earlier to support them, we can help children to stay at home. What we learnt was, and there was great success in these reforms, the key parts of it, though, and I called them the 7 Cs, the commitment of leadership, to hold your nerve even when you're being criticised in the press. You need collaborative leadership. You've got to have your champions out there. You've got to build community that really believe in what you're doing. You've got to have a culture of critical reflection. You've got to be thinking, what else can we do, rather than, aren't we terrific? How can we improve? What are the children saying? What are the families saying? You have to have a congruent message. You have to have a coherent teaching. And the wheels all need to be spinning at the same time. Dr. Sandra Bloom from the States, developed with colleagues the Sanctuary model. And at MacKillop, that's a whole of organisational approach to being trauma-informed, and we teach others that we are accredited, and we teach other organisations around Australia. And that's getting everybody from the gardener to the bookkeeper to all your board members, all on board about understanding what's trauma. And the key difference is, rather than saying, oh, this kid's a devil of a kid, he's doing this, he's doing that, he's bashed up this one, he's property damage here, what's the matter with that kid? Rather than saying what's wrong with the kid, the question, if you're trauma-informed, is what's happened to this kid? What's going on for him? And how do we keep ourselves safe while we help him? Because organisations, this parallel process happens, can start to look like the families that we're working with that have been traumatised. This goes for about 2 minutes. Have I got time, Tim? Because the key thing is around awareness and how we recruit, how we screen, how we train, how we supervise, how we keep people professionally alive. And for the church, this is a big challenge. Professions have structures around supervision and expectations around that, and funding models. It's different in the church context. But awareness from leadership and at every level in the organisation is what's important. So just have a look at this for 1 minute.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 30.
Who counted?
But did you see them walking there?
It speaks for itself, doesn't it? The key message. So how do we wake up, and so information is power. Ray Wire was a British fellow, and he taught me a lot about working with sex offenders in the early 90s. And he talked about, Robyn, there needs to be an arena of safety. You have to scream it from your ads right at the point you're recruiting people. You have to let everybody know. And he was a real prophet. He's died since. But he taught us a lot about this arena of safety, because many offenders actually will be deterred from entering and crossing the door if they actually know people are awake and aware. For many of us, it feels like we're between a rock and a hard place, because it's so difficult to work with all the different factions, this fragmentation that happens, where you have people saying it can't be true and that the media are out to get us and it'll all be over soon, we can all go back to being how it was. Well, thank God the truth's come out, and how can we have this culture of critical reflection where we actually start to, rather than being negative, it's more about having an openness of mind. Eileen Munro did a lot of research in the area of safeguarding and child protection in the UK, and she said you've got to be more like a a detective rather than a barrister defending your patch. So taking off the glasses. And the single most pervasive bias in human reasoning is that people struggle to let go of their beliefs. You've thought this was a good person. We thought we had a really watertight system here. And we're on the railway tracks and we can't think our way out of it. So the importance of saying, rather than my judgment was wrong, actually, at this point, new information has come to light. And we have to deal with that. And when we're making decisions, we have an oral culture often, and we work as a group. And any group dynamic, the thing you've got to keep in mind is you've got to have a devil's advocate. Because as a group, we can be either one end or the other, overly pathologising, seeing the negative, or overly optimistic. So it's really important to have a process where you build in this critical reflection. The Royal Commission talked about a culture where the desire to focus on the children is stronger. That's what denotes a child-safe organisation. And there are 10 standards, as I said, and you'll hear more about them. But I do like this quote, and Rebecca said I should leave it in, even though I was culling slides. Keep me away from the wisdom which does not cry, the philosophy which does not laugh, and the greatness which does not bow before children. And this says to me something about humility. And I think we're all called to be humble, to know to acknowledge what we don't know. And regardless of how long we've been in the game, what children and young people have to say, and to keep them at the centre, and to be open about learning from families and from colleagues from different places that might enrich our practice. And she talks about, this is Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things, but she's a great advocate. And she talks about there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And again, I end where I started and say I applaud you and congratulate you because you are doing the opposite of that, which is a great credit to you. And there's references. I'm happy to share all of that, but thank you.
Thanks, Robyn. Your